Oke, bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Okay, first of all, thanks to Allah Subhanahu wa Taala who has always given a healthy blessing and for all of us, so that we can to be here without trouble at all. And secondly, we never forget to salawat and salam to our Prophet, beloved Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam. Okay, then today we are going to discuss about the second section in part one in discourse analysis. So we would to discuss about the 5 question. Yes.
Yes, right.
Okay, and thank you. So yeah, just direct to discuss about this question, and I will read the question. So before that, let me introduce myself. My name is Nanda Yusuf, and here the member is Zaina Sakina Umar and Canita Mahfuza Roslan. So let's begin. For the first question is, why should we learn the genesis of discourse analysis? Please explain your answer. I'll begin to Zaida Sakina. I provide. Thank you.
Okay, so thank you for giving me this chance. So my answer is the first thing that must be done to understand the basic concept of discourse analysis is to study the history of the emergence of discourse analysis theory. By studying the origin of discourse analysis, it would be easier for us to accept and understand the concept contained in discourse analysis. What is the scope of discourse analysis and why discourse analysis is important to study? I think that's all. How about you, Sister Kanita?
Okay. Why should we learn the genesis of discourse analysis? Because as stated earlier, that discourse analysis has been linked with a wide range of disciplines. Therefore, the history of its development will vary according to the study with which discourse analysis interacts. However, it should be noted here that this section simply concerns itself with a general history of discourse analysis. I think that's all. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. So then in my side, for the first question is, uh, why should we learn the genesis of discourse analysis? Because this is important because at least to understand discourse analysis, we must first know the history of the development of discourse analysis, which cannot be separate from the development of linguistic theories, where and until now linguistic theory have undergone 3 stages of development, namely traditional grammar, structuralism, and functionalism. I think that's for the first question. Let's move into second question. The question is, do you agree with saying that the development of discourse analysis theory is strongly influenced by the developments of linguistic theory? Let's start with Zaida Sakina Umar.
Okay, so do you agree with saying that the development of discourse analysis theory is strongly influenced by the development of linguistic theories? I think yes, I do, because discourse analysis is an important part of a linguistic study that examines the use of language by its native population orally and in writing. And linguistic is one of the factors in the emergence of discourse analysis theory also. I think that's all.
Okay, thank you. How about Chanita?
Okay, my answer for the question number 2 is I agree, because in the main linguistic studies, which examine the use of language by native people orally and in writing, Linguistics is a science that uses language as an object of study. It turns out that in this scientific world, it's not right for linguistics to make language as an object of study. Therefore, it's not surprising that the development of discourse analysis theory is strongly influenced by the development of linguistic theory, which makes students learn about grammar knowledge using appropriate language patterns, knowing the rules that govern how language is used, and etc. I think that's all.
Okay, thank you. And then in my side, for the second question is, yes, I agree too with both of views because as we have known in general that discourse analysis is the main linguistic study that examine the use of language by native people orally and in writing. And we also know that linguistic studies language, not just language, but all aspect in it, be it sounds, words, sentences, and so on. That is why discourse analysis is heavily influenced by linguistic theory or linguistic. I think that's so. Let's move to the third question. So the question is, what do you know of traditional grammar theory? Please explain your answer to this question by referring to these things. I will start from Zaida Sakina, please.
Okay, so this question is have some branch. The first is what is the traditional grammar theory? So traditional grammar theory is the study of the structure as well as the formation of word that we know as morphology and sentences as we know as syntax, usually without reference to sound and meaning. And the next is what is the main principle of this theory? Now, the main principle promoted by the theory is that the grammar in this traditional reflect the perspective view that one dialect or variety of language is to be valued more highly than others and should be the norm for all speakers of the language. The next branch is what do teachers who adopt the principle do in teaching a language? According to the traditional grammar theory, in teaching a language, teachers must make rules of certain languages as an absolute reference, which should be fully studied and followed by all learners of the language. So they are only allowed to speak in accordance with the pattern of sounds, word, and sentences structure of the search languages. Students are not allowed to use language patterns that do not match the reference language. And the next questions, what are the products of this theory? So the product of this theory is have two products. The first is the emergence of language learning approach that studies English using a perspective approach, namely an approach to language that is used to develop and establish rules that govern how a language is used. These rules govern some important things such as standard spelling, grammar, or syntax. And the second product is the publication of 270 English grammars together with a standard English dictionaries as a result of research on the types and categories of common mistakes. And for common mistakes made by learners in the use of language and the use of English. This is done for two main reasons. Namely, the first is to help students in solving the problem of errors, and the second is to encourage and increase use of their language. The next question is, what is the main shortcomings of this theory? The main weaknesses of this theory in the perspective is in the perspective approach. Many linguists believe that language teaching using this approach is not strong enough to develop learners' knowledge and language skills because the focus is limited to standard language only, thus making students' language knowledge isolated or limited only by standard language components. Because of this, linguists then suggest English teachers to use a descriptive approach rather than a perspective approach. Experts argue that using a descriptive approach will allow students to dive into the language at a further level, while also allowing students to analyze real samples of a mixtures of a varieties of English dialects, not only limited to the specific language. The next question, what are grammar translation method and its relation to traditional method? Grammar translation method is one of the method of learning English which is formed by following the principle in traditional grammar theory. This method has been abandoned by many English teachers today, but this method is one of the main triggers for the birth of other teaching methods. I think that's all.
Okay, thank you for Zaida. Next, for the third question is Canita Mahfuza, please.
Okay. For the first question, what is traditional grammar theory? Traditional grammar refers to a prescriptive set of rules and concepts about the structure of language that are commonly taught in school. And the concept of traditional grammar is somewhat different from the grammar of modern linguistics in that the story of grammar is the study of the structure of word formation and sentence, usually without reference to sound and meaning. Because it's a quite rugged and root in the past, traditional grammar is often considered outdated and is often criticized by experts. And the next question, what is the main principle of this theory? The principle in this theory of traditional grammar is reflect of a perspective view, where on dialect or language variation should be valued more highly than another and should become the norm for all speakers of language. This principle, a descriptive approach, is an approach to language that is used to formulate and enforce rules that govern how language is used that apply some important things such as standard spelling, grammar, or syntax, and etc. And next question, what do teachers who adopt the principle do in teaching a language? What the teacher does when adopting this principle in teaching language is that the teacher must make certain language rules obsolete which must be studied as a whole and followed by all language learners, in which students are not allowed to use language patterns that are not in accordance with the reference language, but they are only allowed to speak according to the patterns of sounds, words, and sentence structure of the source language. And the next question is, what are the products of this theory? Grammarists and teachers publish 270 grammars of English along with standard English dictionary for two reasons. The first is to help learners in troubleshooting the errors, and the second reason is to encourage the improvement of their English usage. And the next question, what is the main shortcoming of this theory? The main shortcoming of this theory is the perspective approach, because many linguists believe that language teaching using this approach is not strong enough to develop students' knowledge and language skill, because the focus is very limited on the reference language, which result in student being isolated by components. And the last question, what are grammar translation method and its relation to traditional grammar theory? The method of grammatical translation certainly has relationship with traditional grammar, because in this case, students learn grammar rules and then apply these rules to translate sentences between the target language and the native language, which is in this method of teaching learning that focus on the rules of grammar. This is the same with traditional grammar. which is in this theory emphasizes the rules that govern how language is used, such as spelling standards, grammar, or rules that are considered socially and politically correct, which means that this method is closely related to the method of grammar translation, which emphasizes grammatical rules and applies these rules to translate sentences between the target language and their native language. I think that's all from my answer.
Okay, thank you. Then in my side for the third question, for the first question is what is traditional grammar theory? So traditional grammar theory is the study of the structure and formation of word, morphology, and sentences syntax, usually without much reference to sound and meaning. So this concept is found to be somewhat different from the concept of grammar in modern linguistic studies, where grammar is defined as the study of the whole interrelated system available in the sentence structure of the particular language, such as sound, word, phrase, sentence, and meaning. And the second question is what is the main principle of this theory? So the main principle promoted by this theory is that grammar in this tradition reflects the representative prescriptive view that one dialect or variation of the language should be valued more highly than another and should be the norm for all speakers of that language. The third question is what do teacher who adopt the principle do in teaching a language? So adopting this principle, grammarians study English further by using a prescriptive approach, that is an approach to language that is used to establish and enforce the rules that govern how language is used. So the rules emphasize important things such as standards of spelling, grammar or syntax, or a rule about what is considered socially and politically correct. Next is what are the product of this theory. So although the grammar translation method has been abandoned by many language teachers today, so it should be remembered that a criticism of this method is considered a pioneer of various language and linguistic teaching theories, including the next generation of language theories such as structuralism and functionalism. And then what is the main shortcoming of this theory? So the main weakness of this theory is the prescriptive approach. Many linguists believe that language teaching using this approach is not strong enough to develop the learner's language knowledge and skills because the focus is limited to the reference language, and which consequently makes student language knowledge isolate by the standard language components. And then the last question is what are grammar translation method and what is the relation between traditional grammar theory? So grammar translation method or GTM is a teaching method commonly used to teach grammar with the main characteristic of focusing on translation and memorizing verb forms. When teaching, the teacher usually explain the material using the local language, and this its relationship with the traditional grammar theory is accordance with the main principle that has been discussed in the book, that in teaching a language, the teacher must make certain language rules and absolute reference what that must be studied in its entirety and followed by all language learner. I think that's all by me. Let's moving to question number 4. So what do you know of structuralism theory? Please explain your answer to this question by referring to this thing. I'll start from Zaida Sakina. I provide.
Okay, so we have 6 questions related to the question number 4. The first is, what is structuralism theory and what does the Saussure says about the structure of language? So structuralism theory is a theory developed by linguists because there are weaknesses and dissatisfaction with the previous theory, which is traditional grammar theory. This theory focused on the study of language as a static system of interconnected units. The term structuralism was first introduced by a Swiss linguist, named Ferdinand, who developed a branch of linguistic theory called structural linguistics. The source argues that language is formed by signs, which ultimately produce parole, speech or utterance. Now, speech is then understood as any meaningful event that is made possible and regulated by a pre-existing system where the sign has two components, namely the signified, an abstract idea or concept, and the signifier, a means to express the signified. In other words, a sign is a combination of signified and a signifier and a signified to produce a meaning. Therefore, two different languages have different words to describe the same idea or concept. The next is, what are the main principles of this theory? So the main principle of this theory, there are three main principles. Namely, the first is structuralism puts spoken language to be the first place and written language to be the second place. The second, structuralism employs descriptive approach, which allows learners to try to find the unconscious rules that people follow when they say things like sentence without any prescribed rules in the book to follow. And the last is, structuralism requires learner to learn language skills as a unified system as a whole. Therefore, they need to associate language components for imitation in order to build their skills in the foreign language.
Okay, thank you for Zaida. Next will be answered by Canita. Time is yours.
Okay, for the next question, what is informal method and what is a relationship to the structuralism theory? So in this method, Bloomfield suggests that he brings the principle of structuralism into the audiolingual method, or commonly called the informal method. So this method is called the informal method because it uses native speaker of the language referred to as informant who function as phrases, vocabulary, and who provide sentence to imitate. The relationship between the informal method and structuralism is the underlying principle of structuralism that have guided this theory to language pedagogy and has resulted in the introduction of the audiolingual method or the informal method for teaching foreign language, which has been put forward by Bloomfield as linguist. Okay, for the next question, what are the characteristics of the method? The first characteristic from this method, the first is a language is what is native speaker says, not what someone thinks they ought to say. The second is drilling is a primary activity in the classroom. The third is learning a foreign language is in need of habits using the language, which is initiated by mimic, repeating the use of language components continuously until the learners feel natural to express everything they have learned in the foreign language. And the next is teacher have to lead his learners to practice the same sentence over and over again to gain familiarity with the sentence. The next is teacher's language is a model for the learners to imitate. And the last is communication skill will be attained after going through a long, boring, and repetitive process and rigorous drills. I think that's all.
Thank you for Konita. And then next, the question is, what is the main shortcoming of this theory? Okay, this method does not place much emphasis on cultural teaching in language teaching, and it is one of the drawback of this method. The cultural aspect of the language though are integrated with the learning process of other component of the target language. This is because the principle of language teaching in the theory of structuralism are oriented towards the pursuit of language skill as a comprehensive system. And the last question is, what is error analysis and what is it is relation to the structuralism theory. So error analysis is a method used to document the errors that appear in learner language, determine whether those errors are systematic, and explain what caused them. So native speaker of the target language who listen to learner language probably find learner's error very noticeable, although as well shall she accuracy is just one feature of learner language. So the similarity between error analysis and structuralism is that error analysis pay much attention to the form of the learner's language. It examines the language of the learner based on its basic types, omissive, additive, substitutive, or word order. Okay, then the question number 5 is, what do you know of functionalism theory? Please explain your answer to this question. So I will begin from Konita. Time is yours.
Okay, for the first question is, what is functionalism theory and what does Chomsky say about language? In linguistic, functionalism can refer to any of a variety of approach to the study of description and grammatical process that take into account the purpose of language placement and the context in which language occurs. According to Noam Chomsky, Chomsky rejects all kinds of structuralism theory of language learning that claim language as a habit structure taught by presenting stimulus and response, reinforcement, and association. He also states that learning theories in the two traditional approach couldn't be regarded as a model of how humans learn language due to the fact that much of human language use was not imitate behavior, but it was created from underlying knowledge of abstract rules derived from innate aspect of mind and human process experience through language. And the next question, what are the differences between Chomsky's views and Haim's about language? According to Chomsky, further claim that sentences in human language were not learned by imitation and repetition, but generated from the learner's underlying competence. Chomsky's views of competence is eventually recognized as linguistic competence, which deals with abstract abilities speakers possess that enable them to produce grammatical correct sentence in language. And meanwhile, according to the Helms, coined a different concept. Helms rejected Chomsky's view of linguistic theory by stating that Chomsky's view was sterile. He further held that linguistic theory needed to be seen as part of more general theory incorporating communication and culture. Here, Helms felt that there were rules of language neglected in Chomsky theory that native speaker know more than just grammatical competence. I think that's all.
Thank you. So next question is, what is the main principle of this theory? So the main principle of this theory is the communicative approach that speakers have about the rules of grammar, including phonology, morphology, syntax, lexicon, and semantics. So the rules for their use in socially appropriate circumstance for interaction and communication. According to Chomsky, the communicative approach includes two competencies, namely competence and performance, while according to Hymas, and then complemented by the views of other experts. These competencies are divided into grammatical competence, so sociolinguistic competence, discourse competence, and strategic competence. The next question is, what is CLT or communicative language approach teaching methods and its relation to functionalism theory? So CLT method is an approach that aims to achieve communicative rather than linguistic competence through learners' interaction. This strategy to language teaching is based on the philosophy that in order to learn a language, one must practice using that language to communicative meaning to others. Communicative language teaching can be understood as a set of principles about the goals of language teaching, how learners learn a language, the kinds of classroom activities that best facilitate learning, and the roles of teachers and learners in the classroom. And the relation of CLT and functionalism theory is communicative language teaching sets as its goals the teaching of communicative competence. Perhaps we can clarify these terms by first comparing it with the concept of grammatical competence. The grammatical competence refers to the knowledge we have of language, the accounts for our ability to produce sentences in the language. It refers to knowledge of the building block of sentences and how sentences are formed. I think that's for me.
Okay, so maybe I would continue to the last question. What the relationship between discourse analysis and functionalism theory? So the main principle of functionalism theory is related to the communicative approach. So it pushed many researchers to examine aspects of the language function beside the language form. This is done by analyzing the language discourse of both oral and written to find the purpose behind the use of certain utterances in communication. By identifying the purposes and objectives of language discourse, they could then identify language function of the sentences used by native speakers in their social interactions. The development of functionalism theory has become an inspiration for some linguists to conduct research on discourse analysis, as their efforts to discover the social and cultural aspect behind the language used by humans to communicate. The need of information forms and function, or social and cultural aspect in language teaching has formed a backdrop to research in discourse as the pioneer of the emergence of discourse analysis as a discipline which is used to describe language in context. I think that's all.
Okay, thank you for your answer. So I think that's all for our discuss about this second section in discourse analysis. So before we close the discussion, let's together to say hamdalah. Alhamdulillahirabbil alamin. And let's say wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.